How are you all feeling? Temperature check. Everyone's okay? I don't believe you. How are you all feeling? You are feeling fantastic. And that's what I love to see. We were awaiting some of you to come from that last session because we did not want you to miss this one. Let's talk a little bit about the Departure app, my friends. Have we downloaded it? Day 3. I know I shouldn't be asking this question because it should be in your phones. But remember, that Departure app allows you to even re-watch sessions just like this one. It allows you to build your schedule and slate your program of the day. There's so much that's going on. And remember, you also were given wristbands when you entered again today. That is because we have ongoing performances. You know, this is a tech fest. This is a comedy fest. This is a music fest as well. This is Canadian Music Week, reinvented, reimagined, Departure Festival 2025. Yeah, baby. We are doing it, and it feels so good. It has just been exactly the resurgence of energy that Canada, yes, Toronto, but that Canada needs. So it is my pleasure to be your host here in the Victory Ballroom. I am Patricia Jagernoth. I'm seeing some familiar faces, but some who I've never seen before. So, darling, it is a pleasure to be your host here in the Victory Ballroom. All right, friends, next up is this amazing conversation that promises to be quite bold, quite unfiltered. I think you're going to enjoy this, and loaded with a bunch of insight, tons of insight. You're going to walk away learning a lot. If you have notes, feel free to pull your books out and take those notes because you'll probably want to go back to what you've learned in this information session today. We have Merck Mercuriadis. He is the founder of Hypnosis, Hipgnosis, excuse me, thank you. Founder of Hypnosis Songs, and he told me, girl, I do more than one thing. So you're not just a fun, he is an entity, which I love about him. He has shaken up the music industry by rethinking song ownership and creator power. He is joined by Bob Lefsetz. He is one of the most read and respected music commentators, not just in Canada, but in the entire world. Now, friends, you know he doesn't hold back, and the two of them together, this is going to be fun, interesting, engaging, and spicy. So without further ado, let's welcome the gentleman to the stage and get ready for a raw and real look at business of music, artists' rights, right now. Put your hands together. Woo! Hey, Bob. Hey, Merck. Nice to see you. Enjoy.
So, Merck, how'd you come up with the idea for Hypnosis?
You know, Bob, I think it's very important that whenever you do anything, that it has a purpose, and that purpose is more than just money, more than just power. And I'm sort of commenting on what this panel is called in terms of money, power, and music. The other thing that I would add into that is purpose. And the purpose was really simple. I had had a great career being a manager, privileged to manage people like Elton John, Guns N' Roses, Iron Maiden, Morrissey, Nile Rodgers. As I say, a real privilege because these are wonderful people and it's what I dreamed of all my life. But at a certain point in my practice, I started to also manage songwriters, people like Diane Warren, people like The Dream, people like Justin Tranter. And I realized that there was a real disparity in how songwriters were paid. You know, when you're managing Elton John, you are not looking at one income stream, you're looking at the combined power of many income streams. But when you're managing a songwriter, you're seeing one income stream. What is that songwriter getting paid from their songs? They don't get name and likeness money, they don't have merchandise, they don't play live for the most part, all of those things. So you see this one income stream. And when you look at that one income stream, you realize that songwriters are the lowest paid people in the room. And when you consider that there is no music industry without the song, you know, you don't go to a concert unless the songs are written first. You don't buy the band's merchandise unless the songs are written first. You know, there's no recorded music, there's no publishing. It all starts with the song, yet there's this illogical aspect of our business that they are the worst paid people in the room. So I wanted to change that, and I realized that in order to change it, there needed to be a different valuation on the work of songwriters. What I was very cognizant of was that there was no market for songwriters, no free market for their assets. It was usually what was dictated by the major publishing companies and the major recorded music companies, and songwriters didn't sell their assets unless they were distressed. You know, someone had a tax problem, someone had a divorce problem, someone was getting at a certain point in age where they needed to, make some money available to themselves. So I wanted institutional investors to decide what the value of songs was. So I created this vehicle. I took it to the market, and I explained to the market that, look, the growth of streaming is going to make this a very, very good investment case. But you need to value these songs properly. And you need to recognize that these songs are an asset class that has very predictable, reliable income. And this is what you as institutional investors are always looking for, is predictable, reliable income. And you have lots of options, whether it's oil or gold or pork bellies or whatever the case might be. But this is just as predictable and reliable, because when these songs hit and they become a part of our culture and they become a part of people's emotional lives, they stay with them forever.
Okay, let's go back a couple of chapters. You've always been Merck. What's your real first name?
Mercury.
Mercury, really?
Yeah.
So your complete name is?
Mercury Mercuriadis. Sadistic,
Okay.
sadistic
So,
parents.
What is the special sauce? As you just mentioned, everybody from Elton John to Diane Warren, a lot of people come up with acts. You have come in when these acts are already established. What is it about you and your approach that allows them to say, okay, I trust this guy, I'm going to go into business with him?
Truthfully, and this is not meant to be arrogant, it's just meant from the perspective of what it is that you have to be able to offer songwriters and artists, which is that I'm not corruptible. I'm not going to do anything for money. I'm going to do something because it's the right thing to do. And my belief, and you can consider it to be metaphysical or spiritual, but my belief is that when you make the right decisions, that the money will always find you. When you make decisions that are based on money, it never works out, right? So from my perspective...
Okay, that's always generally good, but there has to be magic beyond. It's a dirty business. A lot of people corrupt. Not everybody is corrupt. So let's use Diane Warren, who was on the scene before you. How did you meet her?
Let me just say one thing before we get to that. So when I'm talking about corruption or being uncorruptible, I'm not automatically going and saying, okay, that person's corruptible because they're prepared to take money. What I'm really saying is that, when you are a Diane Warren, or you are, someone like Justin Tranter was when I started to work with him, you have a vision for yourself, right? And you have a vision for what you want to achieve. And this industry tries to fast track success, and it tries to put you in a position where you compromise your vision of yourself in order to be able to have success, right? So when I say I'm uncorruptible, beyond the money and beyond the ethics that you would expect that go with that, I'm prepared to stay focused on the vision that the artist or the songwriter have for themselves, to keep reminding them of what that vision was, what it is that I believe makes them special, and to stay true to that. Whereas this industry tries very, very hard to move you on to whatever the easiest thing to do is, right? So in terms of Diane Warren, I had many years of Diane Warren pitching me songs and trying to get my artist to sing her songs. She was very successful in one instance when her mother passed away, and she wrote a beautiful song called Numb. And in her mind, the Pet Shop Boys should sing this song. And the Pet Shop Boys had done a couple of covers along the way, things like Always on My Mind, which is a #1 single, but they had never recorded a brand new outside song from an outside songwriter. But this was such a beautiful song that Neil and Chris immediately said, yes, we'll do this song. And they did a beautiful rendition of it, and it became very successful. And Diane and I became close after that. And, the one thing that many people don't realize, you write about it quite often and well, is that short of the Beatles, who only lasted 8 years, right? Every great artist that you are aware of and familiar with has had apathy in their career at some point, whether it's just that they've become too comfortable with their success, whether their managers become too comfortable with that success, whether their record company takes them for granted, whether the record company or audience even take them for granted. A great example is U2, right? So U2 get to a point where they release the pop album in 1998, and after almost 18 years of extraordinary success, no one cares, right? It didn't stop them from selling 1 million t-shirts. It didn't stop them from playing 40 or 50 stadiums, but nobody cared about the record, right? Now, for most bands, that's the beginning of the end. For U2, they dug deep. 4 years later, they came with Beautiful Day, and they had a massive record all over again. But that apathy always hits an artist. And if you go back and you listen to the pop album by U2, it's actually a great album with great songs, right? But the world didn't care at that moment in time, right, about that band releasing new music. As I say, they came back with Beautiful Day, and all was forgotten, and they did even more stadiums and sold even more t-shirts and continued to have an extraordinary career. Diane Warren was in a very similar place, where she was experiencing apathy in her career. It didn't stop her from going to work 6 days a week, writing songs every day, and writing extraordinary songs. But it just was, the timing had gone wrong for her. And I felt that I could bring that back, and I felt that I could introduce her to the right artists and the right managers and the right A&R people that would embrace someone that was still writing at the height of their powers. And she went on to have massive records with Beyonce and Paloma Faith and many, many others. And it's a great relationship. But you also, it's also a two-way street, right? So on the one hand, my love of Diane Warren's music and songs and craft and the tenacious ability that she has, is one part of what makes the relationship successful. The other part of what makes the relationship successful is that she walks it like she talks it. So whatever I say about the music, and I'm always very careful when I'm talking to people about an artist or a songwriter's music to never hype, right? You can't say and do things that the music or the songs can't live up to. And she always delivered songs that could live up to the very, very best. And she always was prepared to never compromise, sometimes to a fault, in terms of her belief in what she was doing.
Okay, Diane has told me she would never sell her songs, and in her particular case, she has no heirs, no children, no direct relatives she wants to leave the money to. Have you talked to Diane about selling? This is obviously, in a previous generation, a previous job, but when you were running Hipgnosis, did you talk to her about selling her songs, and what did that conversation go like?
Yeah, I did talk to Diane about selling her songs. I knew full well that she wouldn't sell her songs because her principles have always been her principles. But equally well, I wanted her to know that the option was there, because even though she doesn't have heirs or family. She has many, many things that she cares about, whether it's animal causes, veganism, I'm a fellow vegan, etc. So I wanted her to know that the opportunity was there. She won't do it,
Okay.
but that's okay.
Yeah, yeah. It is a business, and Hipgnosis was not the only company in the business. So, what was your pitch to people who were interested in selling, and what was your pitch to people who you knew had assets, but it was not known that they were going to sell?
Sure. So, first of all, and I appreciate the vernacular, but I never pitch, right? I go into the room, I raised $3 billion by walking into something like, 300 different rooms. I never used a flip book. I never had a deck. Brokers did, and brokers, shared information with people on slides and things like that, but I never ever worked to one. I always walked in and I told people what I thought the facts were and what the opportunity was, and if they wanted to be a part of it, I said thank you, and if they decided that they didn't want to be a part of it, I also said thank you and went on, because I had complete confidence that these amazing songwriters and the songs that they've written that I believe make the world go round were something that had far greater value than what the music industry would lead you to believe that they had. And that sounds really weird, that the music industry wouldn't want you to believe that these songs were as valuable as they were. But of course, if you have a monopoly on the music industry, and there are a few companies that do, you want to be able to control what you have to pay for these assets rather than pay the free market value for them. And what I wanted to do was to make them an asset class, and as I said before, to have institutional investors and institutional underwriters deciding what the value was, not the music industry. When I talk to songwriters, I talk to songwriters based on what their needs are, and I listen to them from the perspective of what it is that they want to achieve. So if you look at young songwriters that I bought catalogs from, whether that's Andrew Watt or Jack Antonoff or even Mark Ronson, these are all people that wanted to de-risk their future and to be in a position where going forward they could do exactly what it was that they wanted to do from the perspective of being creators, as opposed to what the industry might want them to do. And they wanted the freedom to be able to do that. And if you look at the three of them, they've continued to have extraordinary careers, and having that financial freedom has benefited them all because it allowed them to do exactly the projects that they wanted to do, whether that was Taylor Swift or, whether it was Lana Del Rey or whoever it might be. But my mission, if you like, because I think this is ultimately what's important, is that I created a proposition that wasn't just about money. It was about fighting for songwriters and advocating for songwriters and using the platform, $3 billion platform that I built, to be able to have a say in how songwriters are paid, and to be able to encourage the industry to start to talk about how songwriters are paid, and to move them to a place where there was acknowledgement that there needed to be an improvement in how songwriters and artists are paid. Equally well, the fact that I was willing to do what needed to be done to make songs an asset class that were recognized by institutional investors was something that was very, very important to songwriters as well. And then further to that, the ability to be able to protect their legacies, manage their legacies, and to put them in a position where they knew that despite the fact that they were selling, that their songs would never ever be used in a way that wasn't commensurate with the way that they would want them used. All of these things were very, very important to become a trusted member of that community. And I don't mind saying it, but I think we also became the preferred buyer of the songs as well, because people knew that they could trust me to do the right thing for their songs. And the way that I have sold Hypnosis and exited Hypnosis is completely commensurate with that, where the team that's there is my team, the partners that are involved or the funders that are involved in Blackstone were my partners. They know what my ethos is. They know what's acceptable to me, what's not acceptable to me. They even know that my plan is to buy it again in 3 years' time when their securitization expires. But there's a very, close familial relationship there to ensure that the way that these songs are managed is in keeping with the promises that I made to my songwriters. And that's really what's important ultimately, is that I made it okay for songwriters to be able to sell their assets. Whereas, as I said, prior to me, there were great people. Someone like Larry Mistel created a great company like Primary Wave, but Larry's exposure was people that were in distress, right? I helped to bring a market that made it okay for artists like Pink Floyd to sell their catalogs, for artists like Bob Dylan to sell their catalogs, for Neil Young to sell to me, for the Red Hot Chili Peppers to sell to me. It became something that people recognized that, yes, there's value in what I'm doing, and just as if I'd bought a house and that house became more valuable, I can monetize this because I can trust this person to do right by me.
How did you decide to go on to do it in England as opposed to the U.S. markets? And who came up with the structure such that you had a separate organization that was advising the asset?
Sure. So the reason why I chose England as opposed to the U.S., and I live in both England and the U.S., and I'm a citizen of both, but I'm also a proud citizen of Canada. But I chose England because I believe that music is more important in the life of your average day-to-day Brit than it is in the life of your average day-to-day American. And the reason why I say that is because in England you have a national radio station like Radio 1 or Radio 2, where that radio station plays a song once and as many as 10 million people get to hear it. In America, you need 200 radio stations in order to be able to get that same sort of reach. Equally well, there was weekly musical press, there was monthly musical press, there were all of these amazing festivals, whether it's Glastonbury on the one hand or whether it's Reading and Leeds on the other hand, that families go to together, and all of these things combine to create a kind of perfect storm where the cultural importance of music in the day-to-day life of an average Brit is far greater than it is in most countries. And I thought that the people that, the institutional investors that I would speak to would be people that understood that and that in fact were part of that, right? And it turned out to be correct. I think that when you look at the British stock market, I created two funds at Hipgnosis. I had a private fund with Blackstone, and I had the public fund, which became a FTSE 250 company, so one of the 250 biggest companies on the London stock market. One of the accepted structures for the London stock market is what is known as an investment trust. So you end up in a scenario where you have all of the assets that the company acquires being in one vehicle, which is the public vehicle, and then that vehicle is managed by a manager. So I created Hypnosis Song Management to be the manager, and Hypnosis Songs Fund to be the public fund, and Hypnosis Songs Capital to be the private fund. So that investment trust structure is something that only really exists in the UK, but is a very tried and tested and successful way of investors being able to invest in assets without having overheads, right? So I got paid a fee by the fund, but then the overheads of managing that fund and those assets were my responsibility out of my fee, right? Whereas from an investor's perspective, they had pure play access to these music assets, but no other overheads to go with it.
How did they establish your fee?
It's, you know, if you talk to private equity, for example, there used to be old standards like 2 and 20, for example, where you would get paid 2% of the assets under the value of the assets under management, and then if you got achieved growth over a 20% hurdle, then you would get paid a 20% bonus as well. By the time I created Hipgnosis, that was a thing of the past, and the standard in the industry was 1 in 10 as opposed to 2 in 20. So I got paid 1% of the assets under management, the money raised, and if I achieved growth over a 10% hurdle, then I got paid an extra 10% in bonuses as well. And the important factor, I think, because this was a new asset class, was that I offered to do something that most investment trusts don't do, which is that I offered to make my fee aligned with share price. So if share price went down, my fee went down. If share price went up, then I still got my 1%. And that, if you like, de-risked it for the investors, because they knew that it was never going to just be about, me taking the money regardless of where share price was.
How'd you get involved with Blackstone?
They pursued me. I had 4 different offers from major private equity companies to create a partnership with them, to create a private fund with them. And Blackstone were by far the most impressive. And, I had the great experience with Hipgnosis of working with JP Morgan as both a broker and as a provider of lending to the company. I had great experience with Goldman Sachs as an advisor and as a lender to the fund with Blackstone, the private fund. And I had the wonderful experience of Blackstone being my partners. And I have to say that the rigor that Blackstone bring to anything that they do is very, very special, right? They have a discipline and they have a way of working where they don't allow for mistakes. So, even the committee has a committee, right? Even if you're Steve Schwartzman, there's no freestyling, right? You are adhering to ensuring that everything that you do has had all of the I's dotted properly and the T's crossed properly. And this was important for me because I wanted to, and I still want, and the new iteration of Hipgnosis will reflect this, institutionalization of the music industry is very important, right? As a punk rock kid, I used to think of, the concept of institutionalization as anathema. But what I've come to realize in business is that institutionalization is really a euphemism for logic, right? So that logic distills itself in something very, very simple, which is, who is it that's responsible for making the money? What do we need to do to support those people that are the ones that are making the money? And what is it that we need to do to keep those people happy so that they continue to want to make this money, right? The music industry, which after, more than 75 years almost 100 years of there being a recorded music industry, is still a very unsophisticated place, right? The reason why we have models that are, hey, I'll tell you what, I'm going to advance you some money, you're going to make a record with that money, you're going to not receive another penny until you've paid that money back. By the way, you only get to pay it back out of your share, which is about 1/6 of the money, so you have to work really, really hard to pay that money. And just so that we're clear and so that we're not fooling you, we should also mention that even after you've paid that money back, we still own it, and you'll get your royalty, right? The music industry never wanted an artist or a songwriter to know that at the same time as they were earning money, that they were also creating an asset value, right? That asset value was the domain and the property and exclusive to recorded music companies. If Bob and I were friends at school or uni or whatever, and we decided that we wanted to open up a restaurant together, and we made that restaurant a success, we would pay whatever it was that we agreed between ourselves that we were going to pay ourselves on an annual basis. And then one day, if we really made it a success, someone would come along and say, hey, I'd like to buy this from you, whether it's I'd like to buy it because it's a business that I would like to run, or whether it's because I would like to buy it because I think I can open this in Las Vegas and I can open it in Macau and a bunch of places around the world and make it an even bigger success. We would get, in addition to what we made on an annual basis, we would get, paid for our asset, right? The music industry never wanted artists and songwriters to know that they were creating an asset that had real value, right? And when you look at what I consider to be tremendous companies like, Universal, Warner, Sony, and many, many others, right? The bedrock of those catalogs is what gives those companies their value, right? When you look at Universal's, whatever it is right now, 50 billion euro valuation, right? That's based on assets that were created by artists and songwriters, right? And I wanted to change that. I wanted artists and songwriters to realize that this asset that was being created by them had real value, and that there needed to be a shift in how these deals were made. And the first step was to recognize what the true value of those songs was. And now the second step is to give artists and songwriters options on how to go forward so that they keep that net asset value for themselves, not for someone else. And institutionalization is a very, very important part of it. So me bringing Blackstone into the industry, KKR being in the industry, Brookfield being in the industry, all of these major, private equity houses, institutional investors are people that will work hard to ensure that this industry is institutionalized going forward, and that logic of being able to recognize that it's actually songwriters and artists that should be paid will come to fruition. And just one last thing, and Bob can go on to the next question, is that, when you look at other forms of, how people occupy their times, I don't use the word entertainment really, because I think that music is much more than entertainment. I think music is like love, air, food, water, and music, right? It's an essential component of making our lives worthy, making us want to live. But when you really kind of look at the value of music, it has never been recognized properly before, right? And the songwriters and the artists that make that music aren't recognized properly. So if we compare it, for lack of a better word, to ways that people entertain themselves, In the NHL, as much as 70% of the money goes to the hockey players. In the NFL, as much as 70% of the money goes to the football players. In the Premier League, as much as 65% of the money goes to the soccer players, football players. And baseball is similar, and the NBA is very similar, etc. In music, if we're lucky, 20% of the money goes to the creators, right? That tells you everything you need to know about why this industry needs to be institutionalized.
Okay, let's talk about valuation. Prior to the selling of catalogs, the number was 10 or 12x, X representing annual income. Then all of a sudden it moved to the mid-high teens. You got involved, it went in excess of 20. Let's put it this way. How did you come up with the valuation of catalogs?
Sure. So what Bob is saying is roughly correct, right? Which is that when I started Hipgnosis, valuations were sort of 12 to 14x, right? And that didn't mean that there weren't exceptions. Marty Bandier got laughed at for paying Lieber and Stoller 22 times. And then a year later, everyone was telling him he was a genius when they saw how the catalog performed. The way that my public fund came first, which, as I say, became a FTSE 250 company, which has, in addition to being one of the 250 biggest companies on the market, there's a standard that has to be upheld, a standard of governance, a standard of excellence, if you like. And part of my prospectus that any public company has to publish before it raises money were a couple of key things. One, any catalog that we bought had to be valued by an independent valuer, someone that did not work for Hipgnosis. And we used as many as 10 different valuation companies to value those catalogs independently. Secondly, it had to be approved by an independent board that I'm not a member of or was not a member of, so that all of the boxes were ticked correctly. And then thirdly, the net asset value of the catalogs had to be calculated twice a year, every 6 months. And we used an entirely separate independent valuer to do that net asset value. And the reason to do that was that it gave double protection, if you like, to the investor, in the sense that you had one independent valuer that was valuing it at the time of acquisition, and another independent valuer that was valuing it for the NAV, or the net asset value of the entire catalog, every 6 months. So the way that we did our valuations was very, very simple. We looked at all the data, 5 years of data. We removed what we would call lumpiness. So let's say, for example, that someone made $200,000 a year on average in sync, but there's 1 year where they're suddenly making $1 million in sync, then $800,000 of that would be taken out of the equation, and you would only look at the $200,000 average as being what the predictable, reliable run rate was. And the same went with every aspect of the income, whether it was performance money, whether it was sync, whether it was mechanicals, etc. That valuation was something that my team of underwriters would come up with. Separately from them, you would then send the exact same raw materials of verified statements, etc., to the independent valuers, and the independent valuers would come up with their own valuation. If our internal valuation matched what the independent valuers came up with, then we would present that to the board, independent board of directors, and the board would either approve it or not approve it. If the independent valuation was lower than the price that we were contemplating paying, then we would have to change the deal or not make the deal, and we wouldn't take it to the board for approval if the valuation was lower than what needed to be paid for the catalog. We just wouldn't make the deal. And that way we knew that our methodology was correct because it was being verified by a third party and being ultimately scrutinized and approved by a board.
Okay, subsequent to your exit, valuations in terms of purchase have gone down. I was with one of the major players 2 weeks ago. Leaving out the Pink Floyds and the Queens, there's always, outliers, that they're talking more about 16x now. Harder to get much more than that. What do you think has changed such that valuations are now lower in the marketplace?
Well, see, that's the fallacy, Bob. Valuations were never what other people made them out to be, right? The Hypnosis Songs Fund, the public entity of Hipgnosis, was a fund that required constant disclosure to the marketplace. Disclosure that if you got it wrong, I could go to jail. Someone could go to jail because this is, a publicly traded stock. At $2 billion invested in the public fund versus $1 billion invested in the private fund, the average multiple of Hipgnosis acquisition is 15.6.
Okay, let's go further now. Ultimately, there's rumblings in the owners of the public asset. When did you become aware there were rumblings? How did you address and how did you ultimately manage that personally?
Well, that's a great question, and I'll get to that in a second. But before you get there, I'd like you to ask me, why do I think that people thought that we were paying, 20 times multiples and 30 times multiples and overpaying, right? And you don't even have to ask it, I'll just answer the question for you, right? The reason...
Well, this is a business based on bullshit.
Yes, exactly.
Sometimes you know the people involved, sometimes you don't. That was the perception. I could go on, but we have limited time.
Yeah.
I'm glad to be under the microscope. But
the truth is, as you say, this is an industry that is often built on bullshit. And when you eat someone else's lunch, right, which is the way that I've heard this described in terms of what I did, you find that you have people that come gunning for you, right? And I never cared about those people that came gunning for me. What I cared about was three things, besides my family and Arsenal Football Club, right? I cared about the people that worked with me and for me. I cared about the songwriters that entrusted me with their incredible assets, and I cared about my investors, right? I didn't care about what the rest of the industry thought or did because I knew what the value was of what I did.
Okay, so I'll throw it back to you. Conventional wisdom was that Neil Young got an excess of 20 for half his catalog. Is that an accurate depiction?
That is an accurate depiction.
Okay, so going back to when ultimately things start to go south, tell us about that.
Sure. So Hipnosis Songs Fund, the public entity, traded at a serious premium for the first almost 5 years of its existence, right? And in December of 2021, the share price is at an all-time high. In January of 22, so only 1 month later, give or take the Christmas holidays and New Year's, you have something happen, which is that Russia invades the Ukraine. The stock market crashes. Hipgnosis is one of those stocks that is completely unaffected by this, even though the rest of the market is. because the one thing which is terrific about music is that it's an uncorrelated asset class, right? And by uncorrelated, what I really am saying is that if you're living your best life, you're doing it to a soundtrack of great music. Equally well, if you are experiencing the sort of challenges that the world has experienced over the last 4 or 5 years, which is extraordinary, you are taking comfort and you're escaping with great music, right? Right now, there's someone in Israel, there's someone in Gaza, there's someone in the Ukraine that is getting 5 minutes of respite by listening to music that can make them feel better about where they are in life, and that they can live to fight another day, as it were, right? That's the power of music. So we were completely unaffected by that, but a couple major investors were not, right? I won't name them, but they had what are known as redemptions, which is when the people that invest in you as the investor, give you their money to invest on their behalf, want their money back, right? And the reason why they want their money back is because they're now squeezed financially and they have need for that money. So we had a couple major investors that had to give redemptions across their portfolio back to what you would call their LPs, and we were their best performing stock, or amongst their best performing stocks. So they sold us at a profit, and they used that to pay back the money to their investors. That put a little dent in our share price, right? But just a little one. What then happened, though, was that interest rates started to climb, and the leverage on the fund, which was a maximum of 30%, that the cost of that money became more expensive, and that put, again, a little dent into our share price. What really put a dent into our share price was that one of the independent valuers did an interview with a publication called Music Business Worldwide with Tim Ingham, and I consider Tim to be the best analyst in this business from a numbers perspective. And Tim asked them about the discount rate, right? And the discount rate is a mechanism for how you arrive at value, right? And they said to the independent valuer, what do you expect to happen to the discount rate? Do you expect the discount rate to climb? If the discount rate climbs, your valuations are going to be lower than they were previously. If the discount rate goes down, the valuations will be higher. Every point in the discount rate is worth about 9% to your valuation. And the response from the independent valuer was, no, we don't expect the discount rate to change. So Tim challenged him even further and said, but what if interest rates really, really climb? Like, forget about the couple percent that it's grown already at this point. What if they really climb so that interest rates are 10% again, right? And the independent valuer said, no, we don't expect it to change. That created a firestorm, because for any economic analyst, interest rates climbing, the correlation automatically, economics 101, is that the discount rate is also going to climb and your asset is going to be worth less. The fact that he said no, he and she, in fact, both said no, the discount rate's not going to change, created this firestorm where nobody could believe our net asset value. Nobody could believe Roundhill's, who were the other publicly listed music fund, net asset value either. Roundhill's share price crashed by 60%. Our share price in due course crashed by 40%. What then happened, though, is what really matters in the sense of your question, Bob, which is that activist investors were able to get into our shareholding. And when the activist investors get into your shareholding, you've probably seen Lucian Grange being concerned about the activists in universal shareholding. What these people do is they create noise. And the reason why they create noise is because they want the share price to go down, because what they recognize is that there's an asset here, and the true value of that asset is not being reflected in the share price. So there's an opportunity. The opportunity is you create noise so that people sell shares, you buy them cheaply, and then when someone comes along and buys those shares for true value, you make out like a bandit, right? And that effectively is what happened. We had an activist that got involved. They tried to besmirch me. They created as much noise as they possibly could. Every time they put board members onto the board that were their board members, so those board members were incentivized to create as much noise as possible. Every time you create noise, a shareholder calls up their broker and says, "What is it that you've got me into? Get me the hell out of this." That broker has no choice at that point but to dump stock, and to dump stock cheaply, right? So, we had a major institutional investor that was dumping stock at 75p weeks before the Blackstone deal was announced. And the Blackstone deal was announced at 105p, right? And that was down to, and every one of those shares that they sold at 76p was bought by the activists, right? So when you look at the last 6 months of the public fund, 6 months prior to the sale to Blackstone, 72% of the shares were being held by the original investors. When you then got to the date of the Blackstone deal, 72% of the shares were being held by the activists, who all bought cheaply.
Okay. Ultimately, Blackstone is in a bidding war with Concord. Blackstone acquires the assets. Why did they not continue to use you?
Sure. So basically, the bidding war is something that a company of the quality of Blackstone is never scared of, right? Because at the end of the day, if you've got someone else that's willing to prove price, that's a very, very important box to tick, right? I had a call option on being able to buy those assets with Blackstone, and then if Blackstone didn't want to buy them after 3 months, then I could buy them personally with whoever I put together to help finance that, right? In terms of why I didn't continue, it's very, very simple. There was still a public shareholder vote that was necessary to approve the deal. And that public shareholder vote, with 72% of the shares in the hands of activists, was something that I became very concerned about losing, right? And the reason being is that...
Keep going. We're going to finish this.
Oh,
This is important stuff. I got you.
So I was concerned about losing that vote and these assets ending up in Concord's hands, or for that matter, another third party's hands. It was very, very important to me because of the commitment that I made to songwriters, that Blackstone, as my chosen partners, end up with the catalog, and that the team that I put in place at Hipgnosis, now Recognition, is the team that I put in place to manage these assets. So I wasn't going to risk that. So I sold my interest to Blackstone. I did very well, but the real reason for doing it wasn't to do very well. The real reason for doing it is that with Blackstone now owning the assets and my team managing the assets, in 3 years' time, when Blackstone's securitization is up, I have a real shot at buying it back. if it ended up in the hands of Concord or Universal or someone else, I would never have a chance at buying it back. So I made what I considered and still consider to be the wise decision to do what was in the best interest of giving me the best shot at being able to get it back.
Okay, so you're presently on the sidelines, but you brought up a number of issues. You brought up the valuation of songs. You brought up what percentage artists get of the ultimate dollar that is earned. So, what do we know at this point? The three major labels find it almost impossible to break a new act, and they are not in control of the usual levers because the levers have decreased in power, i.e. terrestrial radio. The way they're coping is they're buying all the independent distributors, i.e. Sony with AWOL. Now we have Universal trying to buy Downtown. Since you have this mission and the business is based on obfuscation and theft, what do you think will happen going forward, and what would you like to have happen going forward?
First of all, I don't see it as theft, right? At the end of the day, there are paradigms that existed and that still exist in this industry that at a point in time, you could have argued on behalf of those paradigms when something like distribution actually was an expense, when artist development was an expense. Those things are irrelevant today. You push a button on Thursday at midnight going into Friday morning, and whether you're in Mumbai, whether you're in Los Angeles like Bob is, or London or Los Angeles like I am, or here in Toronto or Vancouver or wherever, everyone gets to hear the same music, right? Literally at the push of a button, right? So the idea of having to put, manufacture records, having to put them on trucks, I think it's probably worth saying that when I started in this business, more than 40 years ago, I would walk in to an A&R guy, and that person on the opposite side of the desk would listen to a cassette or a CDR later that had 4 or 5 songs on it that, we recorded maybe in a studio or maybe we recorded them at home, but that person would have to make a decision that would involve spending hundreds of thousands of dollars before you ever knew whether the public was going to talk back or not. And that's a reason why we had so much hyperbole in this business as well, is because you had to go out and really sell, because you were making real investments in artists, and then you had to manufacture those records and you had to put them on trucks, and those trucks had to take them all over the world, and everything else that goes with it. So I'm not saying that the paradigms that exist weren't fit for purpose at some point in time, but they're no longer fit for purpose, right? The fact that they still exist today is wrong. Bob mentioned that major recording companies and recording companies of all sorts have difficulty in breaking artists today. I think that's true, but at the same time, Olivia Rodrigo, Sabrina Carpenter, and 100 other artists speak against that. What I really do think, though, is that one of the great secrets in our industry is how difficult it is for a recorded music company to sign an artist today. You have a scenario where the artist is quite rightly sitting there and going, but hold on, you weren't interested in me until I had 200,000 Instagram followers. You weren't interested in me until I had 40 or 50 million streams of my own. So why am I going to let you give me some money that ultimately means that you're going to own me? I'd actually like to be in business with you because I don't want to just be famous in Canada or the UK or the United States. I'd like to be famous all over the world. And you've got people in Brazil, and you've got people in Croatia, and you've got people all, just about everywhere. So I'd love to be able to lease your infrastructure as opposed to being owned by you. And if we can work something out on that front, then great. but the industry is very, very slow to evolve, and no one is really doing what needs to be done to make themselves attractive to an artist, even though I think there are many clever people in this industry. I think someone like Robert Kinsel ultimately understands that Warner is going to end up being a distribution company rather than an asset creation company going forward, and that that they'll be a partner, but they won't be an asset owner. I think that the future is, not to digress, but when Bob and I started in this industry, there were as many as 40 record companies, right? And you could be a little record company like IRS and have, REM and 20 other artists. You could be a medium-sized record company like A&M and have the Police and 75 other artists. Or you could be, the ultimate, prestigious label in Columbia Records and have Michael Jackson and 200 other artists, wow. Right? But at any one moment in time, every one of those 40 labels had 2 or 3, if not 3 or 4 priorities that were real records, real artists that were in play that they believed could be incredibly successful, right? And the industry was smart enough to recognize that there wasn't room for 100 artists on the radio. There wasn't room for 100 artists on television. So you had to be innovative in the way that you developed that artist, in the way that you spoke about that artist, in the way that you marketed that artist, so that they would become sticky to an audience, to people really like Bob and myself. The reason why I read Bob's emails isn't so much for the industry stuff. It's when Bob writes about the records that he loves, he writes about them with a passion that resonates with me, and I think that he's as good as it gets when it comes to that. I still have that passion, but that passion was something that existed throughout the music industry in a different time, right? And that innovation in approach meant that you ended up with an artist like the Blue Oyster Cult, right, that was signed to Columbia Records, that really only genuinely ever had one hit song, Don't Fear the Reaper. Some of you will think of it as the cowbell song on Saturday Night Live, but the band made more than 15 albums for Columbia Records, and every one of those albums sold somewhere between 500,000 and 4 million records worldwide, right?
And I don't want to cut you off, Merck, but we have some really poignant questions. And I'm just getting directed from Randy, and I just definitely want to get some questions in here. Not for you, Bob, just for Merck. Don't worry. Here's Bridget speaking on the artist perspective. Okay, okay. Sorry.
We'll get with Bridget in just a sec.
Okay, go ahead.
So that stopped being interesting to big companies, right? Because they needed to be, when they consolidated from being those 40 labels to being 10, to being 5, to being the 3.5 that we have today, everything needed to be a blockbuster, right? So no one now looks to labels for artist development, right? They generally look at them for a check, and they look at them for the manpower to help bring the records to people. I believe that the future, when you look at Spotify talking about, paying as much as 40% of what they paid to rights holders last year going into independence, the common misconception is that that's going to independent labels. Some of it is, that's true, but most of it is actually going to independent artists directly, and those independent artists do not have options on someone to partner with that allows them to maintain ownership of those assets and that is a genuine partner. And I believe that what you will see is a real value shift that takes place away from recorded music companies directly to artists and managers. And artists and managers will be the ones with the power in the future.
Okay, beautiful. That honestly goes really well right into my question. I was curious, so how do you maintain the rights of these artist catalogs to exploit them? And then sort of, in a way, are you almost replacing the record label in a sense, because you're allowing artists to take their assets and directly connect with investors, which then they can put back into their projects to continue to fund their own things. Is that essentially the idea?
So one of the things that's very important for everyone to recognize about for the creators to recognize, and the people that are supposed to be protecting the creators to recognize, is that what allows this to be...
Just lift your mic, Mark.
Oh, I'm sorry. What allows this to be a real asset class and what allows these assets to have real value is that in general there's pretty good copyright protection around the world, right? So in the case of songs, the general copyright is 70 years after the death of the last co-composer, right? So when you look at the Hipgnosis catalog, we paid a 15.6 multiple on average, but the average length of time is 100 years of copyright protected income streams. So yes, we go to work managing those catalogs, and we work with Sony, Universal, Warner, Cobalt, all of the different administrators. We also administrated for ourselves as well in some markets like the United States, but all of the catalogs were spread across all of those different administrators. And we worked very hard with those sync departments, with the various parts of those publishers and labels that we worked with to add value, because the approach was the same as management, right? Like most publishing, Hipgnosis was never a publishing company. It's a song management company, right? And like an artist manager, I never cared about whether the check was coming directly to me or whether it was coming to me via the label or the publishing administrator, right? My job was to add value and to ensure that the songs were being worked as hard as possible. So if we use, what I consider to be the greatest Canadian of all, Neil Young, as an example, we increased Neil's sync by something like 3,000%. Not because we were rocket scientists, right, or smarter than everyone else, but because we had the bandwidth to go out and create opportunities for things that we knew that Neil would be happy with, right? Whereas most of the incoming opportunities are not things that Neil would be happy with, because those people are just asking, hey, can I use Heart of Gold to sell my burger with? And they don't understand that Neil has an ethos that doesn't allow for advertising, and that's very careful and critical of every opportunity that might be right or wrong for his songs. So we were able to say, okay, we're going to ignore all of that stuff, because out of all those requests, there might be one or two that work, but we're going to focus on finding the right documentaries, on finding the right movies, on finding the right opportunities that are not advertising to use Neil's songs in.
Okay, just no more questions, please.
No more questions. I was just going to do a
just
final
one,
wrap-up if
just
we could,
one
'cause we have to
follow-up.
set up for the
One
next session.
follow-up here. There was a use with Neil Young that he was ultimately unhappy with. He blamed himself, saying he had the right to put the kibosh on, and he and his team did not catch it. His right, in order to say no, the people you made deals with, what percentage of them had that right?
I can't tell you off the top of my head what percentage, but it's very, very few. It's people like Neil, it's people like Shakira, it's people like the Chili Peppers. So I can't tell you what the percentage is, but it's very few. But in fact, I know obviously the example that you're talking about, and what Bob is referring to is that the NFL pitched us on Tom Brady versus Patrick Mahomes. And they were doing a series of interviews with Patrick and Tom that were going to be played when the Kansas City Chiefs, Patrick Mahomes, played against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Tom Brady, in the playoffs. and they wanted to use Old Man, Neil's great song, as a reference point of Patrick Mahomes, the young guy, singing to, Tom Brady, the old guy at this point, kind of David versus Goliath type of thing. And Neil liked the idea, and we liked the idea because we thought it was perfect use for the song. And from Neil's point of view, he did not want to be the artist to do it because he wanted to have a certain distance from it, quite rightly. So Beck became the artist that recorded Old Man and that was used in this spot. Neil blames himself. I blame me. Neil's manager, Frank Gironda, blames himself. What none of us realized was that this concept was part of an advertorial. So even though it was used editorially and it was used in the NFL football game that they said that it would be used in, it was presented as an advertorial. So Neil, quite rightly, from a small part of his audience, took a lot of heat because, hey, you said you'd never be a part of advertising with your song, and here you are, your song's being advertised. I blame myself, Frank blames himself, Neil blames himself. We should all be blaming the NFL, but
Okay.
you got to take responsibility.
Listen, this has really been a master class directly from the source.
Absolutely.
Here we go, Merck Mercuriadis.
Thank you, Bob. Good.
Thank you so much, Merck, and Bob as well, our moderator, and powerhouses right here in the Victory Room. We have a quick turnaround as we have Max from the Arkells that is coming up as well. There will be a poignant chat in that session, but I do have to have the room cleared really quickly, and we will see you all in about 10 minutes. Thank you.